Hello and welcome to the interview. One wonders what Venezuela's independence hero would have made of it. Simón Bolivar Bridge, the scene of thousands, if not tens of thousands of Venezuelans crossing into Colombia, fleeing poverty and violence in their home country. A crisis that was initially met with compassion in neighbouring countries, but as the flow continued, tensions over the migrants grew and some neighbours began to impose restrictions. To analyse the response in Latin America and in the US, I'm joined by Benjamin Gedan. He's a former South America director on the National Security Council at the White House during the second Obama administration, and he is now senior advisor at the Latin American program at the Wilson Center. He joins me from Washington, D.C. Mr. Gedan, thank you so much for being our guest on France 24. What's your understanding of how bad the crisis is today as compared with late August when we were hearing all those dire warnings from the UN and so on?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, no matter how dire the warnings have been, the reality on the ground has been even worse. The humanitarian crisis, which involves scarcities of medicine and food, has led to this incredible outflow of Venezuelans throughout the region.
A few weeks ago, you wrote about Latin America's open door policy for Venezuelan refugees. That was open door was actually the adjective used in the title of that article. Do you think it's still open doors today?
The title and the piece, I think, in foreign policy were a bit provocative and intentionally so. I think the international community has expected Latin America to react very harshly to the migration crisis and to mimic some of the more cold-hearted approaches that we've seen in Europe and in the United States of late to migrants and refugees. I contend that even today, relatively speaking, Latin America has had a very open-door approach to this crisis, although less so, as you've referenced, in the last few months.
What do you think explains that? I mean, is it the cultural proximity, the shared language? Because, of course, in Europe, there's a perception among some segments of the public that migrants from Syria and Afghanistan, they're sort of not really like us, which perhaps explains some of the reticence here. I imagine that's not the case in Latin America so much.
I think for sure that's a factor. These are largely culturally similar individuals who are largely Spanish-speaking, who are Catholic. I think those similarities do make integration less of a burdensome phenomenon. That said, I don't think we've always seen in Latin America open doors. You've seen examples where the Dominicans have not treated Haitian migrants, for example, with particular humanity. I think what you've seen here, though, is a real success of regional integration and simply principled policies toward neighbors in trouble.
How much tightening, though, restrictions are there? Because, as I mentioned, there were some countries that said you can't come in anymore unless you have a passport, and they knew perfectly well that the Venezuelan government was not in a position to issue passports at that particular moment. So it's basically saying, stay where you are. Do you sense a trend towards that now in Latin America, or is it still very sort of fragmented in terms of the responses of each individual country?
So notably, any serious tightening of borders in Latin America that's occurring now is occurring 2 years and 2 million migrants into the Venezuelan crisis. So I think it has taken a very long time for the region to reach anything approaching a breaking point. That said, you're right. There have been questions in places like Colombia, which has absorbed as many as 1 million of these migrants, half of the total, that they've reached their capacity. Places in rural Brazil as well that don't feel like they have the resources to provide for these Venezuelans who come in without funds and in desperate need of health care. I think in those situations, you're absolutely correct. There has been some desire to spread the burden, both in cost and in terms of the numbers that are being absorbed. And one of the ways to do that has to discourage those who arrive undocumented, with full knowledge that the Venezuelan government is essentially administering a failed state and doesn't have the will or capacity to issue documents and has no functioning bureaucracy. That said, when there was a recent emergency conference that Ecuador, Peru, and others organized, I think the conclusion was that the region should continue to absorb and reintegrate these migrants to the extent they can, and to be sensitive to the fact that many will arrive without documentation.
And in terms of how long-term this crisis is, I mean, as you said, it didn't just start in the last few weeks. This is at least 2 years in. Do you think history teaches us anything from other refugee crises around the world? For example, Syrians who are in Lebanon or Jordan in a long-term way, in terms of the pressure that puts on tight labor markets? Or is this region just too different to be able to compare that way?
No, I mean, I think some of the cultural issues that you've referenced are relevant in any region, and I think the economic issues for certain are. Places we've seen like Argentina and Uruguay, for example, much further south in South America, are in need of some of the skilled laborers that are coming from Venezuela. Those that come that far south typically arrive on planes. Often they're engineers who can work in the petroleum industry in Argentina, for example, and are valued. But even there, in a tight labor market scenario, there is resentment that builds. So I think those will be factors, and as the numbers grow, you could expect to see tensions that come from workers who are seeking jobs and feel like they're now competing with a new migrant class. I think what you'll see that's different here is that the Venezuelan crisis is utterly man-made and actually solvable with some reasonable policies and some return of foreign investment and expertise. And so if the question is whether we think these will be permanent communities living outside their country, the country is in shambles, but I think can be rebuilt in a way that would make it once again appealing and potentially, again, one of the most stable and wealthiest countries in the region. And I think Venezuelans would return.
What do you think? How do you think the U.S. administration has handled this crisis, and how different is it from when you were in the White House a few years ago?
The Trump administration from day one, I think, recognized what the Obama administration had addressed for years, which was that the situation in Venezuela was an extraordinary humanitarian crisis, which for moral reasons demanded a response from the United States. And it was also a source of potential instability in Latin America, whether that's questions of migrants, which we are seeing now, or disease and other factors. And it was also a question of a threat to democracy in a region that has fought very hard to establish stable democratic regimes. And now we have a major country in Latin America dismantling its democracy and establishing quite a brutal, repressive dictatorship. For all those reasons, in my time in the White House, this was a #1 priority for President Obama, an issue that he raised with virtually any Latin American interlocutor. I think the Trump administration has given it the same amount of attention and has had the benefit of more regional awareness of the scale of the problem, and so more desire in the region for a coherent regional approach.
Of course, the rhetoric, though, has been, as you would expect from the Trump administration, quite severe. I'm trying to find the best word to describe it, but certainly not the kind of rhetoric that one heard from President Obama. Do you think that has made any difference, or it doesn't really affect the sort of nuts and bolts of policy, really?
I think it does, unfortunately. I think, frankly, it's debilitating. It's a question of soft power and influence. There are countries in Latin America that have decided that working with the United States on Venezuela is a way to avoid any backlash from the Trump administration, any intimidation, any punishments that they've seen Mexico, for example, or some Central American nations endure from an unpredictable U.S. government. But I think fundamentally, the U.S. no longer has credibility as a place that treats migrants humanely, for example, as a place that defends democratic norms globally. And so for these reasons, it is much more difficult for the United States, I think, to show leadership, both with the migration crisis and in defending democratic institutions in Venezuela. So though on the question of Venezuela, I think the Trump administration has been quite consistent with the previous administration's approach, including ramping up pressure and imposing sanctions on very deserving targets in Caracas, Venezuela. The reality is that we are deprived now of credibility and soft power that we enjoyed under previous administration.
Just to bring things back to the situation inside Venezuela, I mean, you touched on this earlier about rebuilding the country, but for now, what we have is Maduro sort of going further into, you know, his view of how reforms should be carried out, which is, of course, not the way that the international community sees it. For example, introducing a new banknote, restructuring state and oil gas company in order to get more oil revenues. What do you think, though? Do you think those measures that he took in mid to late August have made any difference to the crisis internally?
No, not remotely. I think the Venezuelan government is this toxic combination of incompetence and corruption and a group of ideologues. That mixture has resulted in policies that are reckless and disastrous for the Venezuelan people. The evidence of that is clear, and anyone fair-minded knows that the struggles in Venezuela are not the result of some international conspiracy or a U.S. economic war. Frankly, even the Venezuelan government has largely stopped using that rhetoric. They're a man-made crisis created by very poor handling of an economy and the predictable results, which is scarcity and hyperinflation.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being my guest on the interview. Benjamin Gedan, former director on the National Security Council at the White House during President Obama's second term, and advisor at the Latin American program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. That's all for this edition of The Interview. Thank you for watching.
Sur France 24, la nuit, on est très fiers d'accompagner les Amériques dans leurs soirées, de voir l'Asie se réveiller, et on est là jusqu'à ce que Paris s'éveille.
France 24 es más que solo noticias. Es libertad, igualdad y actualidad. Nosotros damos un paso más allá, con información al momento para analizar, comprender, poner en perspectiva y debatir.
Sur France 24, l'Afrique c'est chic.
In Live from Paris, our correspondents around the world keep you up to date.
Vous êtes déjà plusieurs millions et de plus en plus nombreux à suivre France 24 sur les réseaux sociaux.
من الطبيعي أن يكون شعارها الحرية وخاصة حرية التعبير في بلد حرية التعبير.